Good afternoon. It is a wonderful afternoon to be together in a mission that I, as a Catholic priest, can tell you began 2,000 years ago when our Lord talked about transforming the world. We live in modern times, and in Vatican II, Pope John XXIII also spoke of transforming mankind. And he spoke from a position of knowledge because he had witnessed the devastation of World War II, and even worse, the devastation of innocent lives in the Holocaust. It is not an accident that in that council, the bishops of the world reflected upon the Holocaust and came forth with a positive statement called Nostra Aetate, decrying violence against anyone because of their religious background. But sometimes we have to be reminded that there was a time in which religious violence ruled the day. Unfortunately, we've had to look at, in our modern day, that violence rearing its ugly head again and again throughout the world, and even close at home. For example, in Pittsburgh, at the Tree of Life Synagogue. The rabbi who was the leader of that community spoke to us 2 weeks ago after a showing of Schindler's List. And he said, people say, never again, with an exclamation mark. But in today's society, we say it, never again, with a question mark. Because many people forget, all too many deny. And so it's important for us to keep before us the knowledge we have gained and let ourselves be transformed into a more positive response to people's selfishness and hatred. And so today is a great joy for us to look at the experience of one man and then to multiply it over thousands and thousands of millions of survivors as well as their children. And so it is my pleasure to begin the program of finding my father's Auschwitz file. Listen to it, hear it, be transformed by it.
October 3rd, 2011, at 8:30 in the morning, during the high holy days of the Jewish New Year, I walked into Block 24 of the Auschwitz concentration camp in Auschwitz, Poland. The high holy days, the days of awe, is the time of year when Jews contemplate our morality and our mortality, the meaning of our past, our place in the world, and our hopes for the future. It is a time we pray to be written into the book of life, asking for another year from the Almighty. It is a time we pray for the souls of our ancestors and for the future of our children. It is a time of repentance, and during the 10 days between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, a time of almost unending contemplation and prayer. It is the most sacred, holy, and thoughtful time of the year, a time we ask for our lives to be renewed. In 2011, I chose to spend 2 of those days at Auschwitz. Block 24, a former prisoner barrack, is rectangular with a pitch roof. It's constructed of red brick. Unlike the majority of barracks at the Auschwitz-Birkenau concentration camp, which were built of wood and are now all gone due to decay, Block 24 still stands, a brick remnant of the Polish military base located at that site before World War II, before the Nazis took over the facility and turned it into the most notorious death camp the world has ever known. The Auschwitz-Birkenau concentration camp is now a state-run museum, and Block 24 hosts the camp's archivist's office. Prior to my arrival, the last member of my family I know of to walk these grounds was my father, Leon Hershkowitz, when he was a prisoner in this death camp. If other ancestors of mine were imprisoned in Auschwitz during the Nazis' war against the Jews, I do not know. Every Yom Kippur in my boyhood home, before reciting Kaddish for the dead, my mother, Helen Hershkowitz, lit 22 Yortzeit candles in memory of my parents' children, as well as my parents' parents, brothers, sisters, nieces, and nephews who were murdered by the Nazis. Who among those family members perished at Auschwitz? I do not know. My father's first wife and his 2 sons were murdered before he went to Auschwitz. And my mother's first husband and daughter were murdered also, most likely in the Stutthof or the Dachau concentration camp, the 2 death camps in which she spent virtually the entire war. I was acutely aware of the contrast between my father's forced incarceration in Auschwitz and my voluntary visit. In contrast to the filthy, flimsy, and cardboard stiff, striped prisoner uniform my father wore there, I was wearing a finely pressed and tailored suit, a soft, light cotton blue shirt, and a blue silk tie. This one. My father's shoes at Auschwitz, taken from the feet of dead or dying prisoners during his incarceration, were misshapen, mismatched, uncomfortable, and wooden. My shoes were from comfortable Italian leather, which I purchased in Milan. My father could not openly practice his religion at the camp, so I carried with me his black and white tallis, his prayer shawl, in its velvet bag. His tallis is now old and yellowing, narrow, smallish, with knotted fringes. It seems so much smaller to me now than when I was a boy and I watched him cover his shoulders with it in the synagogue or when he prayed at home. I wore a blue velvet yarmulke with silver yarn trimming. It was from my bar mitzvah, which took place on April 27th, 1968, 43 years before my visit to Auschwitz. This was my first trip to Auschwitz. This was my first trip to Auschwitz. I had planned to visit a number of times in the past, hoping to take my 3 children with me, but I could never seem to work out the logistics. More likely, I was reluctant to bring my children there. Over the years, I had no trouble working out the logistics of taking them out west, to Alaska, to China, to Japan, to Brazil, to France, to Sweden, and so many other places. But somehow, I couldn't manage to arrange a family trip to Poland, the country where both of my parents were born. Auschwitz was not a destination I was emotionally able to bring my children to visit. With the 100th anniversary of my father's birth approaching, he was born December 12th, 1912, 12/12/12, I decided it was time for me to visit the camp with or without my children. At the time, my work as a senior scientist at the Natural Resources Defense Council, an environmental research and advocacy group, often took me to Europe. So after delivering a speech in Portugal in September 2011, I took a detour on my way home for the High Holy Days and finally visited Auschwitz. On 3 previous occasions, I had visited the Dachau concentration camp outside of Munich, where my mother was imprisoned. Auschwitz and the Dachau concentration camp frame the emotional structure of my life. Thinking of my father in the course of a day, I think of Auschwitz. Thinking about my mother, I think of Dachau. I still think often about their murdered children and their murdered spouses. When I was younger, I would think of Nazis when I exercised, building up my strength for my own anticipated confrontation. Last week, I dreamt that Nazis were in my home, gassing me to death in my bedroom. When I opened my bathroom to escape, they were waiting for me in the woods behind my home. I don't dream of Nazis every night, but I dream of them too much. Because the Holocaust is so ingrained in my soul, I cannot bear to watch films about it. The few details I know about my parents' day-to-day existence in Auschwitz and Dachau are drawn from the few memories my parents shared. I knew there was much I didn't learn from them about their past, but it was not until I discovered my father's Auschwitz file that I recognized how far from understanding their history I actually was.
Until I was well into my teens, the only friends my parents had were other survivors of concentration camps. More than a dozen survivors would gather in my home on Saturday nights to play cards and share stories, except when I walked into the room, when they all would fall silent. They called themselves the Herring Club, because herring would be served at each gathering. Of course, they spoke only Yiddish, which was my first language. Among them, there was Mira Salberg, a tall seamstress who made my sister's skirts for school, and her pint-sized husband Mendel, who also worked in the garment industry. There was Roman Goldberg, who we called Ramek, an egomaniacal and always well-groomed locksmith, and his diminutive wife Lola, my mother's best friend, and my favorite, who fed me lunch for years when I was a boy in elementary school, because my mother was usually at work. There was Sarah Lenson, another seamstress, missing half of her jaw to cancer, who made the pillows for a couch I built from scrap wood for my first apartment when I was in college. Sarah was married to Shmuel, a rotund man who said little, but ate a lot. I recall how surprised I was to learn in elementary school that some of my Jewish friends had parents who were not concentration camp survivors. I felt similarly surprised to learn that there were Jews who did not speak Yiddish. To say my parents kept me sheltered as a child would be a great understatement, but it was understandable. Having 3 murdered children between them, my parents chose to keep me close to home, very close. Based on regular exposure to my parents' friends and my regular interaction with their children, I deduced that Holocaust survivors tend to fall into 2 categories when it comes to recounting their wartime experiences. One group, seeking to ensure that the world would never forget, spoke often to their children about their imprisonment, telling them everything they could remember. The second group, perhaps too traumatized to recount the horror they endured, perhaps seeking to protect their children's innocent minds, perhaps simply focused on building a new life, told their children very little. My parents were in the second category. As a consequence, my sister, 5 years older than me, and I learned very little about our parents' history when we were growing up. I picked up bits and pieces about their origins from fragments they infrequently uttered, or from the 2 or 3 relatives who also survived World War II, or from the child of another more talkative survivor in whom my mother or father had confided during their herring club games. As a boy, I envied the children whose parents told them everything. They knew where their parents were from. I didn't. They knew something about their grandparents, their aunts and uncles. I was never told why I had none. They understood more about why our parents cried so often, and I knew almost nothing, though I seemed to feel everything. I felt their sadness and their fear. I felt their sense of vulnerability. We were not under enemy attack, but I nevertheless felt that the world could turn upside down at any moment. My mother told me often to trust no one, and reminded me equally often that only an education cannot be confiscated. As a boy, I was never harassed, but I nevertheless came to expect that anything I had might at any minute be taken away, except what I picked up in books. I learned to anticipate that the more happy the holiday, the sadder and more silent my parents would become. There were just too many family members missing, including their 3 murdered children. But as I grew older, I watched the children of the talkative survivors struggle with the emotional scars that come along with learning too much at a young age about murdered relatives, death camps, torture, thievery, and other Nazi atrocities. While it was frustrating as a boy to be kept in the dark, now, as a man, I am thankful that it took many more years for me to learn the details of what those children had learned at too young an age.
On October 2nd, the day before I entered Block 24, I had visited Auschwitz with a guide. Because I had told my guide that my father had been in prison in Auschwitz, at the end of the day, she gave me a form from her car, and she told me to fill it out and said that when I came back the next day, I should deliver it to the office in Block 24. Was the form I was to deliver going to lead to new information about my father's time in Auschwitz? Could a tangible historical record of his incarceration actually exist? Among the short list of brief questions on the form was one titled simply, Camp Number in KL Auschwitz. KL stands for Konzentrationslager, or concentration camp. Of the 1.1 million Jews who were shipped to Auschwitz, about 200,000 were tattooed upon arrival with registration numbers. Another 200,000 non-Jews were also tattooed. I filled in the form with the camp number that was tattooed onto my father's left arm, 124, 124, a number etched into my soul for as long as I can remember. In front of the numbers on his arm was what looked to me to be a triangle. Much later in life, I learned it was supposed to be an A, which indicated that the recipient of the tattoo was a Jew.
According to the writer Primo Levi, whose incarceration at Auschwitz overlapped with the latter month of my father's more lengthy imprisonment, the tattooing operation was slightly painful and extraordinarily rapid. They placed all in one row and one by one, according to alphabetical order by our names, were filed past a skillful official armed with a sort of pointed tool with a very short needle. It seemed that this is the real true initiation. Only by showing one's number can one get bread and soup. And for many days, while the habit of freedom still led me to look at my for the time on my wristwatch, I realized my new name ironically appeared instead, a number tattooed in bluish characters under the skin.
These 400,000 dehumanized tattoo prisoners, my father among them, were actually among the lucky entrants. They were to become slave laborers. By contrast, 75% of the entrants to Auschwitz were arbitrarily selected to be killed immediately upon their arrival. My father was among those who had the good fortune of being selected to be worked to death.
The interior walls of Block 24 are concrete, painted light beige. Windowless steel doors run down the hallway. The doors were all closed when I arrived, so I opened the first one I came to.
The room I entered was the anteroom to the Auschwitz archivist's office. In the middle of the room was a large rectangular wooden table and some chairs. A window at the far end of the room opened to the grounds of the camp. As I entered the room, I noticed that the wall on my right held a large glass window, perhaps 4 feet high by 8 feet wide. Behind the window, a woman sat at a desk, typing. She was young and attractive, in her mid-30s, in her mid-20s, with dark, short, cropped hair. I tapped on the window. She looked up towards me and indicated with her hand I should wait. As I waited, I examined the room where the typist worked. It was long and rectangular, dominated by rows and rows of large metal file cabinets, steel gray and perhaps 6 feet high. The cabinets filled the middle of the room, virtually from end to end, side to side, with about 6 feet of space surrounding the file cabinets on each side for desks and chairs.
What is referred to as the Auschwitz concentration camp is actually a complex of 3 facilities. Auschwitz I was a penal colony, a former Polish military facility before the war. Its barracks were built of brick and concrete. It is the entrance gate to Auschwitz I, and also the entrance gate to Dachau. That displays the words, Arbeit macht frei, work will make you free, inscribed in iron. Auschwitz I is also the home of the State Museum that now administers Auschwitz. Barrack 24 was part of the Auschwitz I penal colony.
The second section of Auschwitz, Auschwitz II, was the Birkenau death camp. Birkenau's imposing entrance gate with the ominous central gate tower and railroad tracks leading through the middle of it straight into the crematoria is perhaps the most iconic image of Nazi concentration camps. There were four crematoria at the Birkenau, and up to 132,000 human beings, mostly Jews, were incinerated there each month after being killed in the gas chambers.
The third part of the complex, called Auschwitz III, or Auschwitz Manowitz, was a slave labor camp where prisoners worked for the IG Farben Company, making chemicals and mutations.
Upon his arrival, my father was sent to Birkenau, the death camp.
After I stood waiting about 3 or 4 minutes in the anteroom, another woman appeared, emerging from behind the file cabinets beyond the glass. She was middle-aged, a stocky brunette in a white business suit. She opened the door leading from the file room to the anteroom, where I stood and she faced me. Her demeanor suggested she was busy and that I had interrupted her. Making brief eye contact and keeping the door open, she pointed to a pile of forms sitting on the table. The forms were the same as the one I had already filled out. Without speaking, she indicated that I should fill out a form, then promptly turned to return to the file room. I stopped her and said, "Please, wait. Yes, I have that form. I filled it out. Here it is." I held up the form. Continuing to say nothing, she let the door close slowly behind her and walked towards me. I held the form up for her to read, assuming she did not speak English, for she had still not said a word to me. I pointed to the line on the form that said camp, number in KL, Auschwitz, showing her my father's number, 124, 124. Suddenly she looked up at me, smiling, somewhat sadly. I felt warm. Certainly, many researchers and scholars come to the archives at Auschwitz, and perhaps she mistook me for a professional researcher when she first approached me. But that shifted when she saw I was inquiring about my father, one of the few Jewish tattooed Auschwitz prisoners who had survived. She took the form from my hand, saying nothing but signaling for me to wait. She then walked back through the wooden door into the file room. Through the window, I could watch her. She walked slowly down the row of file cabinets with my form in her right hand, glancing up from my form to the file cabinets. Again and again, she glanced from my form to the file cabinets.
At the time, the only document I possessed testifying to my father's time in Auschwitz was his original ID card from the Feldafing DP camp, where he was sent after the war to recover. It listed him as a political prisoner imprisoned in Auschwitz during the war. As the Soviets closed in to liberate Auschwitz at the end of January 1945, the Nazis attempted to hide their crimes by hastily and incompletely exploding the death camps, gas chambers, and crematoria. And they set about burning all prisoner records. The remnants of the gas chambers and the crematoria remain, but most of the prisoner records were destroyed. The very few original prisoner records recovered at Auschwitz are among the rarest, most precious artifacts of the Holocaust. Waiting and watching as the woman in white moved down the rows of files, my lifetime of connection with Auschwitz stirred within me. The hair rose on the back of my neck. I took a deep breath when I saw the women in white pull out a 5x7 index card out of a file cabinet. She had found something. She looked at the index card in her left hand. She looked at the form I had filled out in her right. Checking it a second time, she again looked at the card in her left hand and looked at my form in her right. She closed the file drawer. She turned around, and not looking at me, she went to a desk immediately behind her. She picked up a phone and called someone. She read to that person from the index card and from the form I had filled out. They spoke for 3 or 4 minutes. Then the woman in white hung up the phone, put my form and the index card down on the desk next to the phone. She glanced briefly towards me, said nothing, turned, and walked back to the far end of the room, behind the file cabinets where I could not see her, to the area from which she had originally emerged. That was the last I saw of the woman in white. I waited. 5 minutes passed. The form I had filled out and the index card pulled from the file sat on the desk. I kept looking through the window into the room, not daring to turn away. I knew something was happening, but no one was to be seen. The hip, young-looking woman who had been typing when I first arrived was now gone. I stared into the room of file cabinets. I saw no one and continued to wait, never turning my gaze away. Suddenly, a door opened up that I hadn't noticed before, toward the rear of the file cabinet room. A slim, light-haired woman in her mid-30s walked directly to where the index card and my form sat. She studied them for about a minute, then took them and left through the same door from which she had entered. 2 or 3 minutes later, she walked into the anteroom where I was standing, holding the form I had filled out with my father's information. Looking directly into my eyes, she said,
Hello, I'm Edita Kavanyas, an archivist here at Auschwitz.
Hello.
Please tell me, who are you in relation to this person?
I am his son. My name is Alan Hershkowitz.
Okay. We have 3 files about your father. Please sit down.
There is much I do not know about my father and mother. Some of what I do know about their history, I think, is this. My father was a quiet, emotionally gentle, and physically strong man. He was born on December 12, 1912, in Lubian, then a small mercantile farming community in southwest Poland. My mother was a resourceful, intellectually oriented aesthete and a classic East European Jewish cook. She was born in Chazia, Katz, in Vilna, into an affluent Orthodox Jewish family on December 22, 1915. Poland was at one time Europe's largest state, a dual commonwealth, comprised of land deriving from the Kingdom of Poland, which is where my father's town of Lubian is located, and land originating from the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, which is where my mother's town of Vilna is located. In 1922, 7 years after my mother's birth, Lithuania became an independent state. My father's family owned a small cattle farm, and my father was a kosher butcher. His family's home and property were stolen by the Nazis and by Polish anti-Semites during the war. He was never compensated. In the 45 years that I knew him, I never heard him raise his voice or swear. The only time he ever hit me, a swift, strong kick, when I was about 10 years old, was an act instigated by my sister Suzanne, his unqualified favorite in our home. My sister was high-strung as a girl, but who could blame her? She was born only 2 years after my parents arrived in the United States. Complications arose during delivery, and my mother was assisted in caring for my sister early in her life by another Holocaust survivor, Ann Jaffe.
That's me.
Who we called Hannah. Hannah lived with her husband Ed near a building on St. John's Place in Crown Heights, Brooklyn.
After liberation, my father met my mother at the Feldafing DP camp in Germany. She had been assigned to issue the permission slips to the meat butchers in the camp who slaughtered the cattle for inmate meals. My father was one of those butchers. Catching his eye, and because they each needed someone, my mother and father devised a scheme whereby she would issue him 2 calf-killing permits for every one she recorded. He butchered the unrecorded calf and sold it in the DP camp's black market. With the few proceeds they saved, they fled on foot to France in 1946 to find my father's uncle, who lived in Reims, about 90 miles northeast of Paris, where he settled around 1917 after leaving Poland to avoid military service in the First World War. They had to sneak into France, break the border, they called it. And among the few stories they both told me was the one of them traveling for days on foot to get into France, and my mother's exhaustion in doing so. Finally, not being able to travel any longer, my mother decided to give up and told my father that she could not go on. She sat on a down tree and said, "Let me die here." That tree marked the border. They had made it out of Germany. How they managed to find my father's uncle, I do not know, but Rhymes in those days was a lot less populated than it is today. In Rhymes, my father worked in his uncle's laundry and my mother cleaned homes. In late 1947 or early 1948, they never clarified that precisely. They found out that the visas to the United States they had applied for were approved. How they found this out, I do not know, but they did tell me that they had to pick up the visas in Bremen, Germany. Having no passports, only their Feldafing DP camp ID cards, which listed them as stateless. They had to sneak back into Germany to obtain the visas. From documents I received as a result of my Auschwitz visit, I learned that they were married in Bremen, Germany on January 9th, 1948. I had not previously known the date of my parents' wedding anniversary, and it was never celebrated in my home. And shortly thereafter, they were issued tickets for different dates of travel to New York City on a ship called the Marine Tiger.
According to records I obtained after my visit to Auschwitz from the International Tracing Service, my mother departed Bremen on January 12, 1948, 3 days after her marriage to my father. She spent her honeymoon alone on the Marine Tiger headed for America. My father arrived in New York City in early February, and somehow he promptly found my mother, who had arrived 2 weeks earlier and was residing in a United Jewish Appeal domicile on the Upper West Side. When another female resident in the UJA's house told my mother that Iman, your man, was downstairs, my mother thought she was being teased unkindly. She thought she'd never see him again.
They moved to Brooklyn. They were among the first religious Jews to populate the Crown Heights neighborhood after the war. And my father immediately obtained work in a kosher butcher shop on Essex Street in Manhattan's Lower East Side. I arrived on a Friday and had a job on Monday, he told me. My sister and I were both born in Crown Heights, she in 1950 and me, numerous miscarriages later, in 1955. After a few years, my father left Essex Street and opened his own butcher store in Brooklyn, on the corner of Brighton Beach Avenue and 5th Street. And when I was 4 years old, we moved from Crown Heights to 764 East 91st Street in East Flatbush, directly across the street from Ditmas Park. When I was 10 years old, changing demographics demanding less kosher meat and the emergence of what were being called supermarkets put my father's small butcher store out of business. And he went to work in the meat markets on the Lower West Side of Manhattan. From the time I could first remember until I was 12, my father left for work every day at 6 a.m. and returned every night at 8, except on Fridays when he closed his store early for the Sabbath. On Saturdays, he was home. We kept a kosher and observant household. But after a while, our attendance at synagogue on Saturdays diminished. In 1967, my parents formed a partnership with another Holocaust survivor family and opened a Carvel ice cream store on Sunrise Highway in Lynbrook, Long Island. The hours were from 10 a.m. to 1 a.m., 7 days a week, and my parents made the 28-mile round trip from our home in Brooklyn to the Lynbrook store virtually every day for more than 15 years. We never took a family vacation.
My father was not a scholar. It was my mother who taught me the importance of an education. My father didn't teach me to drive or to play ball. He didn't teach me to swim or to shave. He did not teach me to knot a tie. He never once read me a bedtime story or tucked me in at night. And yet, he was far and away the most inspiring man I have ever known. For me, as his son, and certainly in a larger historical context, he was truly a great man. His life, and the life of my mother as well, was a miraculous drama. I sat down with Edita at the wood table in the anteroom, and I placed my father's tallis, his prayer shawl, in its bag on top of it. That shawl, which I had seen my father wear so often during Shabbos services, during the high holy days, and my bar mitzvah, means much to me, and it was especially important for me to bring it to Auschwitz. I took out my notebook, and Edita placed before her the index card pulled from the files on which numbers and words were written in pencil, including the dates June 6, 1943, January 1st, January 18th, 1945, my father's name spelled differently, and another date, 12/12/08. When Edita started speaking to me, I turned my attention to what she was saying and I wrote notes. She was kind, and her gentle tone and the way she looked straight into my eyes when speaking made it clear that she understood that she was providing me with sad but important information about not only one of the most important people in my life, but about a historical figure, a survivor of Auschwitz. Edita again began telling me that it was very rare to find records about Auschwitz inmates, that the Nazis had tried to destroy all records before abandoning the camp. Also, she said she would send me copies of the records they had about my father. It is from those records that she could tell me the following.
Your father arrived here on June 6, 1943. He was shipped to Auschwitz from Pomorze in the north of Poland, where he was kept after his capture. There he was kept in a prison or in a ghetto for Jews. He lived in Auschwitz until January 18th or January 19th, 1945, and he was then forced into the death march. The Nazis shipped the prisoners out on the death march as the Soviets were arriving to liberate Auschwitz.
I had heard of the death march before Edita mentioned it, but I never imagined that my father was part of it. Of the 1.1 million Jews who entered Auschwitz, only about 56,000 remained alive as the Soviets approached to liberate the camp in January 1945. Most of the prisoners were forced into a 4-day death march, during which 20,000 of them were murdered. Those who sought rest, those who needed to relieve themselves at an inopportune time, those who tried to flee, those too weak to pull the hand carts containing the luggage of the SS. All were shot or beaten to death along the march. My father had arrived at Auschwitz in June 1943 and had spent more than a year and a half, 19 months, in the camp under horrific circumstances. I cannot imagine what condition my father was in on January 18th or 19th, 1945, when he was forced into the death march. Edita told me that my father's death march journey took him from Auschwitz to the Gross Rosen concentration camp. I had known nothing about this. During the afternoon of January 18 or 19, the B2B in Auschwitz, where my father resided, was ordered into formation, and the prisoners departed on foot in the direction of Glarich. According to Edita,
It was minus 20 degrees Celsius when he left Auschwitz, and he was force-marched for almost 4 days to either the town of Shechuna or the town of Gleiwitz. From one of those towns, he was put into a freight car and shipped to the Gross Rosen concentration camp, located in what is now the Czech Republic.
Food was virtually non-existent. My father would have been given either a single loaf of bread or a few slices of cheese gleaned from leftover food in the Auschwitz kitchen for the journey. He was given no blanket, no additional clothes or intact shoes. At the end of the death march, underdressed, nearly barefoot, starving, stiff, damp, and freezing from the cold and the snow, my father was sent to Gross Rosen. The route of the Auschwitz death march is documented largely by memorials to the thousands of prisoners murdered along the death march, just before what would have been their liberation.
As a boy, the only nights I ate dinner with my father at the small Formica kitchen table in our home was on a Friday or a Saturday, when his butcher shop was closed, or on a Sunday when the store was closed early. On one of those nights in 1966, when I was 11 years old, as we watched a Huntley-Brinkley report newscast on NBC showing dead soldiers in Vietnam back when the military had not yet learned to visually shield Americans from the horrors of war and allowed cameras on the battlefield, my father spoke at dinner, which he rarely did. Looking at the TV and then turning to me, he said, "I'm sorry, Sonny, to tell you this." Sonny and Butch were his terms of endearment for me. "I'm sorry to tell you this, but I sat on dead people." Apparently, seeing the bodies of US soldiers on TV and knowing I was watching that carnage right there with him, he felt he could share something he had to express, offering information he never spoke about. He didn't elaborate. At the time, I knew my parents were survivors of concentration camps. I had a vague notion that they were previously married and had children who were murdered. But I did not know the names of any of those earlier families. I did not know where my parents were born, how much schooling they had, how many brothers and sisters they had, and how those family members died. And I feared that asking would open up their wounds. I craved any information at all from my parents about their past, so I saw no reason for my father's apology. But in retrospect, having raised 3 children of my own, I understand his well-mannered need to apologize for this gruesome admission. He revealed nothing further. I now assume it was probably in the course of the death march or in the freight car to Gross Rosen that his sitting on dead people occurred.
As the Soviets were coming to liberate Gross Rosen in mid-February 1945, your father was then placed in another freight car and transferred to the Dachau concentration camp. His Dachau prisoner registration number was 140132.
My father was also a survivor of Dachau. I, of course, knew that my mother was imprisoned there. I was told she survived, or rather, was kept alive as part of the Dachau medical experiments. But my father? Of course, my mother never told me about the medical experiments. I learned that from a cousin named Betty, one of my very few cousins, the daughter of my father's French uncle. She was a young girl in Rheims when my parents arrived and was among the first to meet my parents after liberation. Cousin Betty mentioned matter-of-factly that my mother was part of the medical experiments in Dachau during a dinner I shared with her one night when I was 17 years old at her home in Manhasset, Long Island. I was stunned.
At that same dinner, Betty also told me that my mother's daughter, whose name I do not know to this day, I can never bring myself to ask, and my mother's mother were murdered in Dachau. Betty explained that upon arrival at Dachau, the Nazis immediately sent mothers with their children to their death, seeking to save my mother, her mother, my grandmother, took my mother's daughter upon their arrival and claimed she was her own, whereupon she and my mother's daughter were sent to die. This is how my grandmother saved my mother's life. My mother's first husband, her father, and 5 or 6 brothers and sisters, I am still not clear on how many she had, were killed before she arrived at the concentration camp from the Vilna ghetto.
But based on information I obtained on my visit to Auschwitz from International Tracing Service about my mother, it is likely that Betty was wrong about the location of the murder of my mother's daughter and my grandmother, and also about the location of the medical experiments. From information the ITS sent me in October 2012, I learned that the first concentration camp my mother went to after her internment in the Vilna ghetto was not Dachau, but the Stutthof death camp. According to ITS records, she was sent there on September 6, 1941, and remained there for just about 3 full years until August 14, 1944, when she was transferred to Dachau. Stutthof was the first Nazi death camp built outside of Germany, completed on September 2, 1939. It is located west of the Polish town of Stutthof in German, 21 miles east of Gdańsk, Poland. It was the last camp to be liberated by the Allies and was particularly barbaric place where small-scale production of soap produced from the remains of murdered Jewish victims took place. If my mother's daughter was separated from her after the Vilna ghetto, it is likely to have occurred here. The murder of my mother's daughter and mother in Stutthof might explain why the name of that camp was never uttered in my house. Until just a few months ago, I had no idea that my mother was a prisoner there, much less a prisoner there for 3 years. As for my mother as being part of medical experiments, to my knowledge, everyone experimented on at Dachau died during the procedure. If she was indeed part of medical experiments, it is more likely that they were activities at Stutthof, which did not always result in the death of the victim. According to one Stutthof survivor, Maria Hulushevich, Nazi SS commanders forced her to hold the head of Jewish parents steady so they would see their children mutilated in so-called medical experiments. If I would not have been obeyed, I would have been shot if I refused.
I have never allowed myself to contemplate details related to Betty's allegations that the Nazis experimented on my mother. But knowing that Nazis experimented on my mother was even a possibility is an indescribable sadness that I have carried since I'm a teenager.
One of the documents contained in my father's Auschwitz file is titled Departure from Gross Rosen on January 28, 1945. It is a list of prisoners who arrived at Gross Rosen from Auschwitz and who were packed into a freight car and shipped to Dachau on January 28, 1945. Even while retreating from approaching Soviet forces, the Nazis were still obsessed with keeping records of the Jews they intended to kill, to assure that none escaped their grasp. I was told as a child by my parents that they met in the Felding DP camp in Germany after the war. Feldafing was a recovery facility for concentration camp survivors. I have in my dining room in a frame my father's original Feldafing ID card, dated 20.3.46, which indicates he was a political prisoner in Auschwitz. It lists his nationality as stateless. It lists my father's date of birth as 12.12.12, which is what he told me it was, and spells his surname differently. I always wondered how it was that my father got to Feldafing, located in Germany and far away from Auschwitz, which is in Poland. Now I knew he was shipped to Feldafing from doctors. The Americans liberated doctors, and the Americans administered Feldafing. The Soviets liberated Auschwitz and Gross-Rosen. Being liberated by the Americans allowed my parents to immigrate to the West, first to France, then to the United States. Otherwise, my father would have been forced to stay in communist Poland, Czechoslovakia, or East Germany.
Your father had big luck, Adita told me. In a way, I guess he did. Putting aside the murder of his children and wife, the murder of his parents and siblings, and his years in prison, and the almost 20 months, including 2 winters, he spent in Auschwitz, as well as the death march and his imprisonment in Gross-Rosen, Dachau. Adita paused and furrowed her brow. She looked at me seriously. She spoke deliberately and said this.
Something is not clear to me. 75% of the people who were sent to Auschwitz were selected to be killed right away. Of the 25% chosen for forced labor like your father, most died within 6 or 7 months. I heard of one prisoner who lived 9 months and another who lived a year. But your father lived here for more than 18 months. I never heard of anyone living for so long in Auschwitz. It was impossible to survive Auschwitz for almost 2 years, using only camp food. He had to find something else to eat.
He did, I said. He told me that he found a way to steal food from the guard dogs. Taking out a small map of Auschwitz-Birkenau, Adita said,
Okay, here's where they kept the dogs.
She pointed to a location at the southeastern section of the death camp.
He must have worked around here. That would have given him access to steal the dog food.
Did my father steal and eat dog food every day? That is a historical question about my father I just can't bring myself to contemplate for too long. Still, it is remarkable that he lived. As Primo Levi wrote, at Auschwitz in 1944, of the old Jewish prisoners, those with low numbers, less than 150,000, only a few hundred had survived. My father had a low number, 124.
When he arrived, your father was unloaded from a freight car here.
She pointed to tracks on the Auschwitz map located at the western side of Birkenau. He arrived before the main tracks were laid through the center of the entry gate.
Your father came here at a very good time in summer. That made it easier for him to survive. Still, in the summer, the prisoners had to work 12 or more hours each day. In the winter, a little less. After being unloaded and selected for work on June 6, 1943, he was sent to barrack B1B.
She showed me on her map of the camp where that barrack was.
Then, in July 43, 1 month later, he was transferred to barrack B2B, near the Gypsy Barracks and near the crematoria.
And she showed me on the map where that barrack was as well.
The gas chambers murdered groups of up to 2,000 people at a time, and many groups were murdered each day. Then the bodies were carried by Jewish slave laborers to the adjacent crematoria.
My father told me he was often near the crematoria. During my visit to the site where his wooden prisoner barrack once stood, I could see the crematoria less than 100 yards away. He must have smelled the bodies burning. He must have heard the screams of the innocents being gassed. He told me that one night he was forced to sleep right outside the crematoria. He was the first on a line of prisoners scheduled to be gassed the next day. In the morning, a Nazi guard came to the front of the line and said, "We need 5 workers. You, and you, come with me." My father was the first on line, the first man the guard selected for work. He was spared the gas chamber. "I built Birkenau," my father told me more than once. Editha thinks he was involved in the building of the wooden barracks as Birkenau was being expanded. My father told me he was saved in part by having an outside job. Given the proximity of the main gate to the location where the dogs were kept, and given the fact that the entry gate was expanded at the end of 1943, when my father was there, it is likely he was among those slave laborers who built that famous emblematic entrance to Birkenau.
After about an hour of listening to information, I closed my notebook and stood up. We quietly exchanged contact information. I held her hand in both of mine, and she assured me again that copies of the original documents related to my father's incarceration would be sent to me. I left Editha and the archivist's office in Auschwitz I. I walked first to a small gallows and then to the shooting wall, places where prisoners were routinely hung and shot for minor infractions of camp rules. I put on my father's tallis and the yarmulke for my bar mitzvah. I touched the shooting wall with both of my hands and said a prayer. From Auschwitz I went to the grounds of Birkenau. I went first to the camp's western train tracks and stopped at the freight car, sitting at the location where my father was unloaded when he first arrived. I put both hands on it, closed my eyes, and wept. I then walked into the camp. There were others walking the grounds, and a group of Japanese students, a film crew, a group of young Europeans here and there. No one looked at each other in the eye, or at least no one looked me in the eye. Perhaps out of respect for the tears on my face, I walked up the train tracks leading toward the site of my father's barrack near the gas chambers and crematoria.
Suddenly, I panicked. I had forgotten to ask, where on the premises was he tattooed? Where did the Nazis put the numbers on my father's arm? I had to know that. I had to go to that place. I called Editha on my cell phone from the grounds of Birkenau.
Where are you standing?
I'm standing on the central train tracks leading to the crematoria. I am near the place of my father's barrack, facing the gas chambers.
Okay, look to your left. Do you see 3 brick buildings?
Yes, I do.
The one in the back, that building was a washroom. That is where your father was tattooed with his names.
I paused, looking at the building about 500 yards from the central train tracks where I stood. I thought about how I worshiped my father when I was a boy, and how his silence intimidated and saddened me. How it created a distance between us that I wanted so badly to bridge. I recalled how I often proclaimed as a young boy that I wanted to be a butcher, like him, and how he would laugh with pride whenever I said that. It was among the few times that I saw him laugh. I recalled how we once played catch, only once, and once played soccer, only once, before anyone was playing soccer in New York City, and at which he seemed capable. I recalled how those were the only times we played sports together. I remembered the one movie we went to together, The Sound of Music, with my mother in 1965, when I was 10 years old. I felt sad that we didn't share more activities together because he was always working. And I thought about the tattooed numbers on his arm.
I studied the washroom building from afar. The building seemed so small. It was narrow and dark. I tried to visualize the moment he was tattooed. What did he think was happening? How distraught, how forced onto my father's arm. I read recently that getting tattoos of the numbers is now a fad in Israel among grandchildren of Holocaust survivors. However, as I sat on the chair, ready to receive my father's numbers, I changed my mind. I decided that a better way to prevail over the Nazis' desecration of my father's body was to transform his numbers into a flower. I chose a rose, my mother's favorite. I had it placed high on my arm so it could not be seen even if I wore a short-sleeved shirt.
I studied the washroom building from afar. The building seemed so small. It was narrow and dark. I tried to visualize the moment he was tattooed. What did he think was happening? How distraught, how frightened was he? What did he look like? What was going through his mind? Certainly he knew of the Old Testament prohibition against marking one's body, the reasons Jews traditionally do not have tattoos. By the time he entered the washroom, his children and his wife were already murdered. His parents and 5 or 6 brothers and sisters were also murdered. Did he expect to survive? He couldn't possibly know anything about the barbarity of the Birkenau death camp he was about to experience, the gas chambers, the crematoria. How did he survive? Why did he want to? When I was 25 years old, in 1980, I decided to convert my father's tattoo from an expression of evil violation into a memorial of triumph. I was teaching a summer course at Brooklyn College at the time, and one of my students, a Marine, wore a short-sleeved shirt revealing a large tattoo of an open-winged eagle on his arm. I asked him, where can I get a tattoo? And he told me about a New York City fireman who lived in Park Slope, Brooklyn, who did tattooing to earn spare cash. I went to visit the fireman and told him to tattoo my arm. At first, I considered having him tattoo the same numbers on my arm that the Nazis forced onto my father's arm. I had read recently that getting tattoos of the numbers is now a fad in Israel among grandchildren of Holocaust survivors. However, as I sat on the chair ready to receive a tattoo, receive my father's numbers, I changed my mind. I decided that a better way to prevail over the Nazis' desecration of my father's body was to transform his numbers into a flower. I chose a rose, my mother's favorite. I had it placed high on my arm so it could not be seen even if I wore a short-sleeved shirt.
On November 4th, 2011, 1 month after my visit, just as Edita had promised, I received an email from Piotr Szapinski of the Auschwitz Office for Information on the former prisoners. Attached to the email were copies of 3 documents, one of which was the Auschwitz induction form, containing the information gathered by Nazi interrogators upon my father's arrival in the camp. The Auschwitz induction form was 1 page filled in with the handwriting of the Nazi guard who interrogated and physically evaluated my father after he made it through the initial immediate death or slave labor selection? Who was the interrogator who made his momentous choice? How old was he? Is he dead now? Did he work alone? Or were there many of Nazi evaluating my father?
How did he treat my father? What condition was my father in while he went through this ordeal? He had just gotten out of a freight car from his prison in the north of Poland.
The induction form is titled Konzentrationslager, Auschwitz, and the header line at the top asks, reason for imprisonment, to which the Nazi interrogator provides the following straightforward answer. Jude, Jew. Immediately to the right of that is indicated the number that was tattooed on my father's left arm. 124, 124. Under the header of the Auschwitz induction form, the first line lists my father's name as Hershkowitz, Israel. This spelling of my father's name is different than his name as I knew it. Leon Hershkowitz, the name he ultimately came to have after his processing at Auschwitz, Grossrosen, Dachau, and Feldafing. It's the name he brought with him to the United States in 1948. Moreover, his middle name was not Israel. Beginning sometime at the end of 1938, the Nazis started to require every Jewish person to adopt a middle name that would distinguish him or her as a Jew. The Nazis mandated that all women take on the middle name of Sarah, and that all Jewish men take the middle name of Israel. What his true middle name was, or if he even had one, I will never know.
On the induction form, my father's birthday is listed as 12/12/08, not the 12/12/12 I know it to be. His birthplace is listed as Lubian, as is his pre-capture residence. Lubian is in southwest Poland, near the German border. On the small cattle farm that he and his family owned, my father worked as a butcher. And on his Auschwitz interrogation form, his vocation is listed as worker. His Grossrosen transport listing describes his vocation as Fleischer, or butcher. His nationality is listed as former Poland. Being a Polish Jew was the worst combination when it came to the Nazis' agenda. The fifth line of the Auschwitz induction form asks my father's nationality, and the sixth line inquires as to the name of my father's parents, which is recorded as Yona and Rivka. That line also records my grandmother's maiden name, Kranik. My middle name, Joel, is derived from my grandfather's name, and my sister's middle name, Regina, is the name of my maternal grandmother. Then, the form inquires about my grandmother's and grandfather's race, which is listed as Yud, Jew.
Race, Jew. As I translate this line of the form, I stop, sigh, and take a long pause. I dwell on the words race and Jew. Is there a more divisive word in the English language than race? Race is an utter fiction, writes Wade Davies. We are all cut from the same genetic cloth.
The eighth line on the Auschwitz form asks the habitation of my father's parents, and the line on the form is filled in with two abbreviations in German that I can only assume means they are dead or whereabouts unknown.
The 9th line on the form asked the name of my father's wife, not my mother, but his first wife, who was killed with his younger son at their home in Lublin when the Germans first invaded. From this form, I learned that her name was Cypre, a name never uttered in my home. I vividly remember the shock, the visceral blow I felt in my belly as a boy when I learned that my father had a previous wife and my mother a previous husband, and how I felt I had to bear that information alone. It could not be discussed. Not even my sister and I spoke about it. Under the name Cypre, line 9 asks where she resides. And as with my father's parents, it indicates that she is dead or her whereabouts are unknown.
My father told me the war started on Sunday and I was captured on Monday. He was close. It must have seemed that he was captured on the second day of the war, given the proximity of Lublin to the German border. But September 1st, 1939, the day Germany invaded Western Poland, was a Friday. When the Germans first invaded, my father was not at home. Upon his return, he found his wife Cypre murdered, along with his sister and his youngest child. I recall my father telling me that his younger child was a 2-year-old boy, but I never learned his name. My sister thought this child was a girl. His older child, a 5-year-old son named Heineck, was still alive, but he was not alive for long. As my father tried to escape with him, the boy was shot. According to what my father told me, his last word was Tata, which means daddy in Yiddish. According to my sister, my father told her that Heineck's last words were, "Don't worry, Daddy, they won't get you." After my father was captured in early 1939, he was sent north to the town of Pomorze, to a prison from which he was later sent to Auschwitz in 1943. I did not know of his incarceration at Pomorze until Edita provided me with this information from his Auschwitz file.
The 10th line on the Auschwitz form asks how many children my father has or had, and it indicates 2. He told me he had 2 sons, but he could not bring himself ever to discuss them.
Line 11 of the Auschwitz induction form asks about my father's educational background. It indicates that he attained the 4th level of school. My mother's family included rabbis and other scholars, and she was raised in an urban intellectual environment. She completed gymnasium, equivalent of high school, while my father's only education was perhaps some years at Heder. My father was an ethical, hardworking paraglide. He loved to tinker with repairs around our home. He liked to paint our outside porch, but he worked so much, 5.5 days each week at the butcher store, 7 days a week at the Carvel ice cream store, and for very long hours at both places, that he also liked to rest. He was not intellectually cultured, as my mother was, and their different origins sometimes caused tensions as they grew older. However, little money my family had, and we had little. My mother nevertheless said, "There is always money for books." My father, by contrast, would wonder why I needed to buy another book when I already had so many on my shelves.
The next section of the Auschwitz induction form is macabre. Entry spaces include the following physical attributes described by the Nazi evaluating my father. Height, 167 centimeters. Nose, straight. Hair, brown. Build, not decipherable. Mouth, normal. Beard, none. Appearance, slim. Ears, medium size. Eyebrows, brown. Teeth, good. The form also inquires as to the language he spoke, Polish and German. Whether he had any infectious diseases, no. Was a pension recipient, no. Or strangely, whether he had a special license plate, no. Last questions on the form inquire whether my father was involved in any political organizations. He wasn't. And whether he had any criminal or, quote, political convictions, end quote. He didn't. The bottom of the Auschwitz induction form ends with the following statement, requiring my father's signature.
It has been pointed out to me that my punishment will be due to the intellectual forgery of documents if the aforementioned documents are proven to be false. My father's signature then follows.
During 1973 and 1974, Elie Wiesel launched his influential seminar called The Holocaust as Literature at City College. City College was his first academic home. This was 12 years before he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, and I was one of his first students. On April 9th, 2008, during a speech Elie delivered at City College when he was awarded an honorary Doctor of Letters degree, he recounted a conversation we had when I was his student. According to the City College transcript of that speech, Elie said,
"One day one of my students, a sensitive young man who was eager to learn, came to my office and began weeping. When he stopped weeping, he said, 'My father was married and his wife and children perished during the Holocaust. And my father was married and her husband and child also perished. My parents met after World War II in a displaced persons camp, and they had me. But I know that whenever they see me, they don't only see me.' And that is why he wept."
I remember that conversation well. It was the first time I had ever shared feelings about my parents' history with anyone. The conversation took place while Elie Wiesel and I discussed the essay I was required to write for his seminar, in which I imagined what my father might have felt and thought when I first asked him why he had numbers tattooed on his arm. Elie Wiesel's philosophy, that it is life that ultimately shows us the way, is true. And yet, suffering is the part of life that guides us to wisdom. From the time I learned that my parents had 3 children murdered, I knew that I would have 3 children to replace them, that I would make another attempt to soothe their wounds, that I would bring back what the Nazis took away. And I did. So there was no greater joy for me than to bring my parents together with my kids. For 25 years, I have had photos hanging in my office of my father pitching a baseball to my oldest son, something he never did with me, and my mother happily cooking with my daughter and hugging my youngest son when my kids were young. I view those photos as much more than photos of grandparents with their grandchildren. They are much more. They confirm my family's triumph over the Nazis. The word perseverance is etched into the top of each of my parents' gravestones. My mother, Helen Hershkowitz, died July 1st, 1994 in St. Vincent's Hospital in New York City, just down the block in Greenwich Village. She was 78. As she lay dying, I asked her to help take care of my children from wherever she was going. "I'll do my best," she said. Those were her last words to me. My father, Leon Hershkowitz, lived on for 6 years without her, then passed away on October 20th, 2000, at the age of 87 in Delray Beach, Florida. The last words he said to me, after I told him I loved him while he lay in his hospital bed, were words I had never heard him utter before. "Yes, honey, okay, I love you too."
Brennt de Feuer und ihr Sturm ist hings und der Rebel lädt kleine Kinderlach, dem Olive Bees und der Rebel lädt kleine Kinderlach, dem Olive Bees, solche Kinderlach gedenkt der Zeiere, wo sie lehren da. Such sie noch einmal und sag ihr noch einmal, komm jetzt Olive, oh. Such sie noch einmal und sag ihr noch einmal, komm jetzt Olive, oh. Lernt Kinderlach, lebt mit Frieden, lernt dem Olive Bees. Glücklich ist der was kennt die Teure und das Olive Bees. Glücklich ist der was kennt die Teure und den Olive Bees. Avinu Malkeinu, Shema Kolenu. Avinu Malkeinu, Chatanu lefanecha. Avinu Malkeinu, Chamol aleinu, ve'alol aleinu, ve'tapenu. Avinu Malkeinu, kal letever, ve'cherev ve'ra'av me'aleinu. Avinu Malkeinu, Tsar umastin melenu. Avinu Malkeinu, Avinu Malkeinu, kodvenu besefer chaim tovim. Avinu Malkeinu,
Thank you very much, everyone, for coming here today and being witnesses to this extraordinary story during the Holocaust. I just want to tell all of you that years ago, I was invited to an installation of an archbishop in New York. His name is Edwin O'Brien. He became an archbishop in Baltimore, subsequently moved to Israel. When I arrived at the ceremony that day, I happened to have an extra ticket with me. There was an elderly Catholic woman who wanted to enter St. Patrick's, but she didn't have a ticket. So I went over to her and I said, here, I happen to have one more, please take mine. And she looked at me and she said, my God, who are you? I said, I'm a rabbi. I said, a rabbi? Only in New York for a Catholic to get into St. Patrick's Cathedral, you need a rabbi to give you a ticket. And I think of that woman today, and I think of that story, because I think what you've witnessed here today as well, with people of all different faiths, is we need to open doors for one another. When my parents arrived after the war, also having lost children, brothers and sisters, parents, one of the first groups to greet them were the nuns of St. Mary's Church in Lynn, Massachusetts. They helped my parents rebuild their lives together with the members of the Jewish Center in Lynn, Massachusetts. So we all need each other. And if I could just give you one final scene. Any of you from Brooklyn? Yeah. So if you travel or you sit on the Bell Parkway, you'll come to that entrance to the Verrazano Narrows Bridge where Staten Island is about to greet you. There is a faith chapel there. Actually, there are different faith chapels there. Just as you're approaching Verrazano Narrows Bridge to the right, all the different faith chapels. And what does it say to you? You want to travel safely in this world? You better learn to travel together. I think that's one of the messages of today. We're very honored to have a panel. To my right, a good friend, a member of my extended family, Imam Tahir Kukaj, who's with the Albanian Islamic Cultural Center on Staten Island. Next to him, you've met Alan Hershkowitz, right? So you don't need any further introduction. Alan, all I can say is the strength, the inner strength that it took to write this is really something that I find inspirational. And I think it says to all of us, not to forget, but what else are we going to do after we remember? We'll talk about that today. Reverend Gina Sharpe, who's co-founder and former guiding teacher at the New York Insight Meditation Center, and Ann Jaffe, who a survivor, an educator, a lecturer. Thank you as well. Do we have any children of survivors? I know at least one here. Would you please stand for a moment so we can recognize you? Thank you. My first question, really to the non-Jews on the panel. Obviously, when a Jew reads the story, a Jew talks about the Holocaust, there is an emotional, internal reaction. I want to know how a non-Jew reacts upon hearing this story. Imam?
First of all, I'm very grateful and honored to be here. And as an Albanian and as a Muslim, as a human being first, I was very touched and moved as you were with the group that you were telling us the story. As a believer, also reading the Bible, or whether the Old Testament or the New one or the Holy Quran, Almighty God tells us stories in order to guide us. As I was telling Alan shortly before we got here, the story is a light that enlightens our minds and our hearts. So whatever there is a darkness, these stories enlighten that space. So we should not allow that darkness to come again. As mentioned, never again. As long as we have lights, darkness, there is no space for it. So these stories, of course, any human being should be touched and should be moved. We as Albanians, we had very touching stories as well. We go back, we have a lot of similarities with the Jewish people. We've been also denied rights to exist from a lot of forces in Europe. In Europe, there are a lot of good people, but also there were a lot of troublemakers. We Albanians are known also, those they have had the courage and guts to risk their lives to save Jewish lives. In our mosque, Rabbi Potasnik knows that we have a small museum of pictures of heroes. They have saved Jewish lives and survivors as well.
Let me just tell you, if you have an opportunity, read about the Albanian rescue of Jews during the Holocaust. There was a concept known as Besa, of doing good. And I remember going to many gatherings with Albanians, and they said they were Jews, they were Albanians, they were part of our extended family. Reverend Sharpe?
How much time do I have? So I think we're always tempted to think about what we can do to fix this. We hear this story, and of course our hearts are completely underwater. We're touched so deeply by the level and degree of cruelty that we as human beings are capable of. And we wonder, how is this possible? How is it possible to have so little compassion and so little empathy for our fellow human beings? So that's my first response. And I think about the Buddha's words, that hatred does not cease by hatred, but by love alone is healed. That is the eternal law. So that we're tempted to hate in response to hate. But in fact, I think our responsibility is to find where love can actually grow in our hearts, especially because there are parts of all of our hearts that are tempted to hate when we find difference or we even see this kind of cruelty. But it's not, we can't live in darkness without light. And who has the responsibility to shed light? It is we who have the responsibility. It is not someone else. So I'm reminded also of Martin Luther King's saying that darkness does not drive out darkness, but darkness is driven out by light. So I think that when I hear this, of course, I'm deeply touched, and it was really hard a couple of times to hold it together reading this story, because we are human beings and we do understand the level of cruelty that we may be capable of, but we also recognize the level of love that we're capable of, and what does it take for us to be constantly committed to growing love in our own hearts and spreading it into the world.
Thank you, Reverend. And you speak to young people.
Yes.
What are some of the messages you convey to them?
Having been a teacher for many years myself, after I retired, I decided as a Holocaust survivor, it's my duty to teach the younger generations as to what happened at that time. And I used my own personal story to convey to them and to show them there were all kinds of people, even in the darkest times. There were some extraordinary, wonderful people who risked their lives to help Jewish people survive, and some were very disappointing to us that have decided to use that hatred and to collaborate with the Germans. The message that I send the young people, and I show them that if I was able to overcome the hatred that I felt for our persecutors, that it's possible for anyone to overcome hatred. And I give them an example. I am one of those very lucky survivors who has survived with my parents. And after the war, when we did not, they didn't take people to concentration camps from our area. But we found out about the concentration camps and how many Jews were killed, brutally killed. I was enraged. I was so angry. All I could hear is the free world knew what was happening and they did nothing to help us. And so I was extremely angry and hateful. And I expressed it loudly and clearly. My father overheard me talk about this hate, and he was appalled. He said, "Come sit down, I have to have a serious conversation with you. We were victims of hatred. Did you like it?" And I told him, "No, I hated it." Then he said, "Then why would you do to others that which was hateful to you? Change your life. Instead of hating, be an example of goodness, kindness, and caring, and acceptance of other people." It took some time. It didn't happen overnight. And I have learned to follow his advice. And I'm pointing this out to those young students, and they're very grateful. Hatred doesn't come, from out of the air. When we're little babies, we don't know of hatred. We acquire it because we're taught somewhere, whether parents or society teaches us to hate, which is a very terrible thing. So we have to stop and teach the young people, when they will have families, they should take time out and teach their children acceptance and kindness instead of hatred.
Alan, what was your purpose in writing this besides Remembrance?
Well, first, thank you all for coming and for having the kind of sensibility that we all have in terms of understanding what we need to do, as Ann and Gina and Imam just pointed out. And thank you for participating in this, and Zelda and Reverend Brown, wherever you are, thank you very much. It was an unplanned thing. It was coming up on my father's 100th birthday, and I had, for professional reasons, I had gone to Dachau a few times because I was in that area, but I had never gone to Auschwitz. I always, as I said, I wanted to do the trip with my kids, but I couldn't work it out, and it was already October 2011, coming up on his 100th birthday. I had to go, so I went. I hadn't even heard of the archivist's office at Auschwitz. I hired a guide for day one, and then the second day I was just going to go by myself to meditate on the grounds. But when the guide found out about my father, she gave me this form and told me about the archivist's office, and I went in, and then, wow, suddenly, I couldn't believe that there was real information. I was crying, the hair on the back of my neck stood up. I couldn't believe what was happening. And that night, October 3rd, the first day was October 2nd, October 3rd, after my second visit, I just went back to my room in Krakow, and I wrote for about 10 or 11 hours. I wrote my notes from my notebook, but I also wrote the conversations I had that I didn't take notes on, like, for example, the washroom. And I did it for my children. I just wanted, and in fact, recently, because the New York Review published a big excerpt of my book, I had to show them the documents to verify the facts. So I went back to my files, and I saw emails that I sent to my kids saying, "You're not going to believe what I found out." And I just wrote it for my kids. And then a month later, I got more information from Auschwitz Archivist's office and the International Tracing Service. So I worked on it really until about 2013, but then I put it away. And I had no plans to do anything with it. And then we got the situation we're in now. And, the rise in hatred, the anti-Muslim rhetoric, Charlottesville, no leadership at all pushing back on it, providing proper guidance. And it was a year ago today that I called Andrew Levine from the Sheen Center and I said, hey, I got this story, I want you to read it, because I think next Holocaust Remembrance Day we should do a reading at your place. And I said, and it's a Sunday, and we can do it in the afternoon, so I won't take up much of your time. And Andy read it, and he said, wow, this is actually, I want to show it to Bill, the guy who runs this place. And Bill read it, and he said, yeah, this is something we should do. And it sort of just happened. But basically, I was putting something together for my kids, and just documentation for my kids. I never really thought of it, in the same way that the best careers were unplanned. This sort of came about. I would say it's ironic that for 40 years as an environmental scientist, I had been dying to get an article in the New York Review of Books. And it was like, it's my, everybody knows my favorite journal. And then this happens and I get into the New York Review of Books for something entirely, not what I do for a living. So anyway,
You said something, Alan, that I think many people worry about very much. The book and the movie. We read the book, we read the Bible, we have all the statements there, what we shouldn't do, what we should do, and yet the movie is so different when you go out in the world today and you see this rising hatred in so many different places. And one of the things we've learned is the hatred may begin with the Jew, it doesn't stop with the Jew. And many others have been victimized. But I will add this, and I think we can't lose sight of this. Pittsburgh was a horrible moment. But I also ask people to remember the week after Pittsburgh. I walked into a number of synagogues, for example, Central Synagogue in Manhattan. There was the imam on the bima. I couldn't even get a seat on the bima. I was sitting with the pews, but he was up there. A lot of interfaith leaders, a lot of people of different faith groups came together post-Pittsburgh. In South Carolina, where there was that horrible shooting in the church, a number of people traveled to South Carolina and say, we're going to pray with you as Jews, as Muslims. It's our responsibility. So I hope the story doesn't stop with Pittsburgh or South Carolina. I hope we tell the story of what happens a week after, but it is so disheartening that here we are reading this story and we're still talking about hatred.
Yeah, one of the things that really triggered me was the separation of children from their parents, that the U.S., I don't want to get political, but I'm just saying, because, my mother had her child taken from her.
That's right.
My parents had their children taken from them. And the fact that, and if my parents were alive, I don't know really how they would react to that. They would, I really, it's just inconceivable that a government like the United States of America, that they're actually agents of the government, and who participate in the separation of children from their mothers and fathers. And then, so that happened. My wife and I, we were actually up in New England and we found a demonstration to attend. So there's just, right now, it's a dark time. I never thought that I would ever see Nazi, I thought it was over. When I finished studying with Wiesel, I moved on. I said, okay, I'm going to do science. I'm going to do social justice through environmental science. I thought it was over, and it ain't over.
I'm glad you weren't political. So, one of the things that comes across, I remember my mom, when she would look at my report card, Sid, this is probably true of your mom. The first thing she looked at was conduct, right? A lot of moms did that in your lives. You could be very bright, you could do well in other stuff, but God help you if you didn't get a great grade, not a good grade, a great excellent E in conduct, or deportment, I think, as they called it then. So here we have the value of education. We teach our kids education is vital. Now you look back at the Holocaust. You look back at horrific periods. Educated people did this. What does that say to you about what's lacking in education?
Heart.
Reverend?
Heart. So because our culture appears to put the mind, the rational mind, above the feelings of the heart, and they're actually equal. So that if we can be brilliant people, and we're certainly noticing it on the political scene. We're not getting political, I know. However, it's not as if people that are cruel and inhumane and hateful are stupid. Many of them are, as you can recognize from all of the people who've been indicted, they all have great degrees in law and accounting and business and history even. And yet, where is the heart? So that even though, of course, it's helpful to know history, it's helpful to understand what it means to be human in the sense of what our history is. We need to understand what is happening here in this human heart, in the midst of this human heart. And so the education should not just be about rational thought, but also about the education of the heart.
Reverend, I think someone said years ago, education can make us smart, but not necessarily moral, right? So we need that component. I think, Ann, did you want to say something?
No.
Hold the mic closer.
I have my opinion about those things. I think that hatred starts at a very young age at home, and society supports it, and that's how we become murderers sometimes. This is why it's very important to make sure we can do only what we can as parents, as grandparents, teach our children not to discriminate and not to hate anyone. But there are so many more people that we have no control over the others. But be a good example to them. I don't mean turn the other cheek, we have to stand up for our rights, but be a good example and show them what kindness and acceptance really means.
I would probably add, not only educators, they are the one that they did all these troubles, these atrocities, but also those they claim religious, whether imams or reverends or as we know, the religious wars. But I believe the answer to this, to stop all that, is we have to treat each other as a human being. As soon as we go to the titles, to the names, to the belongings, that's where the interest gets into. And of course, always there are as many good people that there are in the world. There are always some troublemakers that they use these, differences between, instead of looking into that parts of integration, parts of working together, they use it to turn people against each other. But treating each other as a human being, I believe this is the key to avoid a lot of troubles, a lot of wars, a lot of mistreatment. And education, of course, it's very key to enlightening people's mind. Of course, the behavior, as you mentioned, your mom, it's part that should not be replaced by anything. If you are not human being, people, they are gonna, very little are gonna benefit from your knowledge. All those bombs, all those rockets that are being thrown to communities and countries, there is no sense of humanity there. Instead of using all these bombs, and instead of using science to destroy people's lives, we look into a different perspective. We still can benefit from each other without killing each other.
This is a big issue. First, let me just, no one has a monopoly on virtue. I think we understand that. but we see the world through our work. And, for me, work is about money and meaning. And, I always educated my children to say, you have to have a mission, you have to have a cause, you have to have purpose. The money's gonna come. And I know folks who are wealthy and they look for meaningful work. But in our economy, it's a paradox. Our economy is based on, frankly, extracting value from other people's labor, there's a certain inherent exploitation. And of course we've all heard, well, it's just business. This is, don't take it personal, it's all just business. How do you reconcile the way the market economy is based and then ask people to love each other? It's, so much of our preoccupation all day long, based on need, on fear, on greed, whatever, is to somehow not connect with people, but to use other people. And I don't necessarily mean it even a malicious way, but in a functional way. But love requires practice. Eric Fromm, of course, in his book, The Art of Loving, he points out, it is an art, and arts require knowledge and practice. And we don't practice that. I know that in my upbringing, it all boiled down to one thing. What's hateful to you, don't do to anyone else. Everything else was commentary. What's hateful to you, don't do to anyone else.
That's the Jewish golden rule, right?
And, I travel around the world. My heart is open. My heart is, it's painful to see the way, so many people, 4 billion people don't have toilets. 4 billion people, more, don't have toilets. And 26 people have more wealth than 4 billion people, at least according to last week's New York Times. So when you talk about education in that context, and at the same time, we also have to acknowledge, as my therapist reminds me over and over again, these are not resolvable issues in our lifetime. I just recently read another beautiful biography of Thoreau, and he's talking about, the Fugitive Slave Act. Congress, 100 years ago, passed the law requiring northern states to return escaped slaves. Our government passed a law extending slavery to Western territories. Our government genocided Native Americans. And we could go back, and this is why, when putting this together, we said, we need, every denomination we could get, our, young, old, different religions. There is a vanguard of humanity that has to lead the way, and that's, I think it's everybody in this room. But there are systemic challenges because so much of our economy and our relationships are actually built on dehumanizing and exploiting people.
We're going to conclude. I just want to say the following. Someone died not long ago who was a retired firefighter. His name was John Vigiano Sr. He lost 2 children on 9/11. One was a firefighter, the other was a policeman. When I met John, the father, I said to him, "Do you believe in God after all of this?" He said, "Rabbi, God didn't kill my kids. Terrorists killed my kids. Human beings killed my kids." That's why Elie Wiesel used to say to those who say, "Where was God?" We have another question. Where was man? Where were human beings when all of this was going on? There's a famous question in Jewish tradition, as some of you may know, 2 people in the desert, 1 canteen of water, enough for one to drink and survive. If both drink, both die. The question becomes, who should drink from the canteen? In keeping with Jewish tradition, there's a debate, back and forth. And finally, the consensus opinion is the person who owns the canteen has a right to drink from the water. It's his canteen. But the person who survives drinking that water has a responsibility to keep alive the memory of the person who wasn't able to drink from the canteen. I think all of us come here today, having listened to this special reflection, this discussion. I think we recognize we all have a responsibility beyond remembering, a responsibility to do something to those who need our strength and support, to those who are hurting so deeply in today's world. Jewish, non-Jewish, it doesn't matter. As was said before, we may have different faiths, but we all belong to one family. Thank you all very much.